Good afternoon. On behalf of the University of Houston Law Center, Dean Leonard Baines, and the Law Center's Diversity and Inclusion Committee, welcome. My name is Meredith Duncan, and I am one of the co-chairs of the Diversity and Inclusion Committee, along with Professor Jeff Hoffman, who is also here. We're thrilled that you have enjoyed us for this presentation by UH Professor Holly M. Hutchins, entitled Debunking Your Flawed Logic by Challenging Your Inner Imposter. Before we get started, I want to start with a few housekeeping matters. We have enabled the chat function for this webinar, which can be used for responding to Dr. Hutchins' questions or prompts throughout her presentation. The Q&A function is also enabled for attendees to ask questions of our presenter. We plan to have time at the end of the presentation for questions and answers. So please use the Q&A function to present your questions, and we will get to them time permitting. Many thanks. Now for our speaker. Dr. Holly M. Hutchins is a professor of human resource development and the department chairperson at the College of Technology at the University of Houston. Her research expertise is in training transfer, program evaluation, and faculty professional development and leadership. Dr. Hutchins' work is published in several leading human resource development and human resource journals. She is also a co-principal investigator on an NSF Advanced Institutional Transformation Grant, where she co-leads efforts to increase the recruitment, retention, and advancement of women and women of color faculty in STEM-related disciplines. Dr. Hutchins has received numerous college and national research awards and is co-founder of the Academy of Human Resource Development's Mentoring Partners Project. She has a wonderful wife, 2 spirited daughters, and 3 slightly behaved dogs. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Hutchins.
Thank you, Dr. Duncan and Professor Hoffman and the committee members of the Diversity and Inclusion Committee and the Law Center. I also want to thank Dean Baines for his advocacy and his leadership and inviting me here today. It's a wonderful honor. I have to say that I have a personal affinity for law schools and the law profession. My father is an attorney entering his 50th year, and my younger sister is a 3L at the University of North Texas. So those bookends provide a really interesting experience for me and my family in terms of the law profession. I'm going to make an assumption here before I get started, and that is the majority of people on the call, students, faculty, staff, alumni, have pursued a profession, the legal profession, because you have a desire for justice and a desire to pursue justice and to seek justice for those individuals that have been denied justice. And a foundational aspect of what I'm going to share today is the importance of taking care of yourself in that fight. Because the inner critic, which is the focus of my research and my work for the last really almost a decade, has addressed just that. And 2 important things happened this week that really challenged that. Challenge in thinking about where injustice still remains, for instance, in the lack of charges brought in the Breonna Taylor murder, and how we continue to seek justice in those areas in terms of racial discrimination, specifically toward Black and brown individuals. We're also reminded of another important aspect, and that is the importance of dissent. And in the passage of Ruth Bader Ginsburg, we are reminded of yes, her experience, her long experience and reputation in the legal profession, but also of the importance of her dissents. And today, as I reflect on both of those very important women, I'm also reminded about how this connects with my comments today. The importance of dissent, the importance of questioning the status quo. And that really sets the tone for what I'd like to share with you today. Now, listening to Dr. Duncan's description of some of my work, you probably are wondering, why on earth am I talking about the imposter phenomena? I mean, with some of those accolades, you may think wow, this is probably a foreign concept to me, but I can tell you that I have struggled with feeling and thinking like an imposter for a really long time. It started in graduate school. It didn't leave me at all. In fact, it revisited me in my early careers as a faculty member when I came to the University of Houston in 2004. And I didn't even have a name for it. I didn't know it was a thing, and I surely didn't talk about it. I suffered like so many people in silence. And the way that it manifested was in panic attacks and depression, anxiety. And what was so concerning to me and my family is that I almost decided to step away from a career that I had spent over 2 decades preparing for. Now, as a researcher, I got really curious about it as well. And when I sought professional help around it, I realized that there was a name for it. I realized there were ways to address it. And I began getting really curious about it. And what I want to share with you today is what my research has shown in terms of not only the experience of feeling and thinking like an imposter and the impact on work outcomes, which is really an area that we haven't explored enough, but also what we're doing about it. That's the question I get often. So, okay, that's fine that so many people experience it. You hear celebrities talking about it, you know, students talking about it, faculty talking about it. But the main question for me, which is really focused my research and advocacy, is what can we actually do about it? So if you're like me, here's some of the things that go through your head. When is someone going to find out that I really don't know what I'm doing here as a faculty, as a leader, as a student? And the perception that everyone else seems to, I don't know, be doing okay, succeeding, except for me. I feel inadequate despite my degrees or expertise or being admitted to the law center. I just don't feel like I fit in. Now, those experiences in isolation are fairly normal for early career, mid-career, and even as you go through transitions within your work or your life. But when they begin affecting your well-being consistently, when they begin impacting your job satisfaction, your work outcomes, you're wanting to leave a job, that's when we begin to actually look at it. And that's when some of the tactics and techniques that we found in my research can actually make a difference. So how fast can you complete this bingo card? I want to see how many of these things ring true for you. So I'll pause just a moment to see, and feel free to post bingo in the chat box. And Meredith, if you could tell me how quickly individuals post that would be helpful.
Okay, I will do that.
So as you read these are some of the typical statements people that struggle with imposter phenomenon tell themselves. And if these resonate with you, then you have a bingo. Or more than, say, 3 or 4 of these resonate with you. So as you get
several bingos, I'll have.
Okay, very good.
Several times over as well.
Okay, wonderful, wonderful. So I'll show you my bingo card, and this is something that I completed just recently in terms of preparing for this presentation. And I can tell you, although when we think about early career experiences, becoming new to a profession or new to a program, et cetera, you may think that that's mostly related to those experiences, but it's actually not. I continue to grapple with my own inner critic as I look at career transitions within my own life. I've been a department chair here at the University of Houston now almost 2 years, and these things still come back to me as well. So you're in good company. that's one of the reasons I wanted to include this, is that one of the most powerful things, and really half of the battle in grappling with your own inner critic, is normalizing that a lot of people experience this. So I'll give you a working definition here, and then we'll move on to some of the work that I'm doing in terms of helping you, again, challenge that flawed logic. So imposter phenomena was coined back in the 70s when two psychologists were working with a group of highly successful women. These women were credentialed, these women were experienced, they'd won lots of accolades across their career, and yet they were really having a difficult time internalizing that success. And so the psychologists began identifying that not only did they have these issues concerning internalizing personal achievement, but they had a lot of distorted thinking patterns, problematic thinking patterns, all or nothing thinking, where they really were diminishing and not really owning their success, but also having lots of different reasons for why that was so. But what we found over time is that actually imposters are objectively competent and successful. In fact, I would argue that the individuals who most struggle with feeling or thinking like an imposter are actually those who really aren't, that are quite competent and successful. The issue is they just don't believe it, and they tell themselves a much different story about their achievements or how they became who they are. So as I mentioned before, I got really curious about this. After I got help, which was mostly on the clinical side, I began looking at this more from a research, because, you know, research is what we do, right? You know, the self is instrument. So I began asking my colleagues a lot of questions about how the imposter shows up in their work. And boy, did they talk a lot about it. So here are a couple of articles if you're interested. And now I want to share a little bit more about what I've learned. The first is that competent professionals, both women and men, experience IP or imposter phenomena across their careers. If you watched the Oscars a couple of years ago, you may have seen Viola Davis's really impassioned acceptance speech. She hit the trifecta, right? Winning the 3 main awards for an actress. And in the after party, she was interviewed by Entertainment Today or something like that. And she talked about how even despite all of this, each time she arrives on a set, reads for a part, she feels like an imposter. And so now that this term is sort of in the wider lexicon, what we find is the individuals that again are struggling most are individuals that continue to experience it across their career. I said that it began with a study of women. Research has shown that men and women actually experience this quite a bit. I'm going to share a little bit more about how men experience it, because it was one of the big findings in my research. And we see that it also cuts across socioeconomic level, race, first generation status, different ability level. So it's quite universal in terms of the way this shows up in individuals. I also want to remind you that there is a difference in feeling and thinking like an imposter when you're quite competent and can objectively show, wow, you know, there's evidence against this. But as an early career person, I know there are a lot of students on the call right now, first-year students within the Law Center here at the University of Houston. And as you progress up this ladder from becoming, you know, a novice and going up, you know, to an apprentice, and in red you can see that I've marked out, because this was originally for a medical student development based on some of the research around identity and professional progression. And Meredith, thank you so much for offering me some insights as where law students would kind of find themselves. That it's perfectly normal and understandable that you feel early in your career that you don't know, you know, in some ways you don't know what you don't know, but you don't know enough to feel really as an expert, or don't know enough to feel confident. That's because you're learning. And as you're developing knowledge and skills, even as you progress throughout your career, there are moments where you're going to feel perhaps more like this. And that's perfectly okay. Another way of looking at it is something that we use in my field in talking about the developing, a line of competence. And so, first not knowing what you don't know, then knowing that you don't know it, and then becoming more aware and more confident in your ability. And then as it hits to the mastery level, not really thinking about it that much. But you can see here that developmentally, not being as assured of your knowledge and skills, not feeling as adequate, all of those are perfectly normal as we progress in our identity development, especially around our profession. Now, where it can get really difficult is when these become persistent thoughts and they begin to manifest again as depression, as panic attacks, but also as overworking and also as perfectionism. And I'm going to talk about that in a little bit later too, but these are some of the work behaviors that we've been seeing with our students that I see with my faculty sometimes, individuals opting out of career opportunities because they fear that others won't see them in the same way in terms of their expertise that they have. And so they begin doubting their own ability as well. So in one of the projects that I conducted, my research team and I interviewed several faculty, both at a public institution or a Research One institution, also at an academic medical school, a teaching medical school. And what we found were there were very discernible trigger events that can bring about an imposter episode or an experience. And these were interestingly around successes. When individuals would get awards, they were recognized in a seminar, maybe they were asked to do interviews. And I can remember sitting with, in the interviews and hearing very recognized, very credentialed individuals say, I don't even take those interviews anymore because I am so worried that people are going to find out I really don't think I know what I'm talking about. Even though, again, they're recognized for their achievements. So they were intentionally opting out. Social comparisons, this is especially true as you compare yourself, which is, again, a fairly normal experience, to other people. And so faculty were getting really tripped up as they heard other people talk about either their research or expertise or what they were doing in their labs. And again, trying to measure themselves next to that other person, which again can be problematic in terms of that. New opportunities or transitions, like I just shared when I went from the faculty line or faculty experience into a department chair, when I went for promotion to full professor, those thoughts and those at inner critic really got kicked up again for me. So even as you progress in the middle of your career, later in career, new opportunities or transitions can also bring those experiences back. Being the first or the only, there are a lot of studies coming out now about the experience of feeling and thinking like an imposter for first generation students, in terms of being the only underrepresented minority, for instance, in your class or your program or within your faculty. That also, its intersectional approach brings a lot of different concerns and issues. So we do focus a lot on students and faculty around this issue specifically. And then lastly, just work challenges. So, and I remember faculty and sharing when they would get a question from a student in class they didn't know the answer to, and then they would go home and they would work relentlessly to try to figure out that answer, just that overworking and ruminating and feeling like I must not be, the subject matter expert I thought I was if I didn't know the answer to the question. So different work challenges, difficult experiences. And oh, by the way, we're in a pandemic, right? So a lot of my colleagues have been reaching out and saying, oh gosh, I'm trying to, be a parent, a partner, do all of this and work, and I don't feel adequate in doing any of it. And so a lot of people are struggling with this feeling as well. So what do we do about it? One of the main findings in my work was around this issue of how does it show up in the workplace? And so one of the big findings was that we don't cope with feeling and thinking like an imposter really well. It leads to burnout, or it's a contributor to burnout. A lot of the faculty expressed low job satisfaction, higher work-family conflict, and lower career striving. So, and as we're taking it out of, well, it's just a common experience into impacting work outcomes, there is an argument to be made that as a workplace, as we're onboarding students, we need to really be sensitive in addressing these things with specific strategies. And just to give you an idea of some of the ways that, at least in our research, we found people were coping, they certainly were doing things that were, as we would call, adaptive. Social support, reflecting on successes, but moreover, individuals were reporting negative coping, denial, overworking, isolation. And the issue with this is that it only provides temporary relief. Individuals would say, well, yes, you know, overworking, pushing through a deadline would help, but it would always come back. And sometimes it would come back even stronger. And I would just not be able to work on a project for a week or two, or maybe several months. But what happens is that we found that some of these coping mechanisms only address or provided temporary relief and not really address the source of stress. It increased not only the cognitive demands, but the emotional demands. And because individuals in the height of imposter experience, or if it's fairly persistent, they don't seek out support, they stay really quiet and isolate, it continues to deplete the resources that if they had, they'd be able to offset the demand, which really is the way that we describe stress. And at the end, the work and well-being outcomes worsen. So again, experiencing persistent imposter thoughts is not something that, well, it just happens to people, but really it has pretty significant and sometimes severe outcomes if not addressed. So I'm going to do some shout outs to social work now. As I was in the midst of this research and looking at all the data, I was introduced to a clinical professor in social work here at the University of Houston named Donna Ansberg. And Donna turned me on to an approach that I was sort of familiar with, but not as familiar with in an applied setting. And it's called cognitive processing therapy. Because I was really on the lookout for what could, other than anecdotal, coping mechanisms, what's an evidence-based approach that we can use to design a workshop or an experience to help individuals really grapple with this. Because one of the things that I found in interviews was that overwhelmingly, both men and women would say, yes, we believe that all of our faculty have it, but what's interesting, women are more likely to talk about it and men more likely not. In fact, what we found was that men especially would engage in more of the negative coping than women. And so some of the work that we've done has been published and picked up by different media outlets that argue that sometimes the men are at higher risk because the way that they cope is really through the denial and not actually reaching out and getting support. And so for us, cognitive processing therapy, our therapy-informed approach, was really quite powerful. And this is an approach that's widely used with veterans, with PTSD, and also with women mostly in terms of domestic abuse survivors and sexual assault. So it is an evidence-based approach, focuses on the content of your cognitions and the effect of those on your emotional responses and behavior. And so we spent a long time looking at this. I worked with Anka Vajanovic, who's a clinical professor here at UH in psychology. She has worked with a lot. She works with a CPT approach, or uses a CPT approach with veterans at the VA here in Houston. And we worked with her and two of her doctoral students to take a clinical approach, which really is a 12-week approach, and adapt that to a non-clinical setting. And really the essence of this is this: don't believe everything you think. And so for the next little bit in my talk, I'm going to walk you through just a real short preview of what we share in that workshop. And we'll have some time for audience response as well. So the first step is sharing your story, or bring in, so the workshop we've designed is we have individuals bring in a critical incident, a story of when they've had a significant imposter experience. And we're really not concerned about the details or the data of it, like who it involved or when did it happen or what was the context. We're really wanting individuals to say, what did you tell yourself about why it was happening? You know, describe the feelings, describe the thoughts around that. And it's really quite powerful because for many people that have gone through the workshop, we've offered it now 5 times, 4 at the University of Houston, and a 5th time actually with an industry group of executives in a biotech firm. And what we found is that these stories range from, you know, not feeling confident in speaking up in meetings to experiencing rejection on a grant, or again, a success story. It's been a range of different experiences. And for many, it's the first time they've spoken about it in public. And so there's a really powerful part of just sharing your story, knowing that you're not alone. And with that comes a normalization of that this experience that a lot of people have. So in sharing that story, we focus on the second part of it, which is to identify stuck points. So stuck points are these recurring messages you're telling yourself about who you are in this story. And typically they follow a little bit of a formula, an if-then statement. So for instance, here's an example from some of the research we've done. If I really belonged in this program, then I wouldn't feel so lost in my courses. So in working with some students, this is a common stuck point that our students will have. And it's something that this is not just with the one imposter story that they bring in, but it's because it's a stuck point, they reiterate that statement to themselves over different experiences. Using all or nothing words or absolute words like should or must. Some of the other examples, I should be able to know all the new developments in my area and profession. When I miss out on something or I'm asked about it that I don't know, I feel inadequate. And the inadequacy continues through the day. They ruminate on it. They search, you know, trying to find the answer to that. So again, it's stuck in the psyche, and it becomes a really easy, slippery slope to continue telling yourself that. Another example, because I don't know the answer to a student's question, I must not really be an expert in my subject matter. It's something I heard a lot across the interviews that we did. So I'm going to ask you now to post in the chat, what is, if you reflect on an imposter experience that you've had recently, perhaps, or maybe just a significant one, what is a reoccurring stuck point you tell yourself in your imposter story? And I'll pause here. Meredith, if you could, you know, tell me what's going on in the chat.
Okay. And while people are participating in the chat, typing things up, one of the things I thought about is just thinking to oneself, well, this is just a problem with your self-esteem, Meredith. This is a self-esteem problem. So how is self-esteem related, or low self-esteem? Is that the same as imposter phenomenon?
So low self-esteem has certainly been highly correlated with imposter phenomena, but it's not all of it. It actually works in conjunction with, you know, low locus of control, you know, low emotional stability, and heightened levels of, I would say, maladaptive perfectionism. So it works in concert with those things. And certainly when we talk about esteem or even self-efficacy, some of the approaches in terms of gaining mastery, so we talked about that, you know, stair step in terms of your gaining knowledge in your profession, expertise, can certainly assist with that. But it's not just that. There are other things going on with that. So that's why a cognitive approach and really getting into an underlying belief is one of the ways that we can address that.
Great, thank you for that. We have quite a few comments, so should I just read them off?
Sure.
If I continue to be afraid, I'm not improving, says one person. Another person thinks, I don't belong and no one wants to hear what I have to say. Or, can there be a codependency in this as well? I guess that's another question that someone was asking. Others have said, another comment, oh, there are a lot of comments. Another says, I'm only here because I got lucky. Anybody could have done what I did. It was no big deal. I'm not going to get rehired for next summer during my summer internship because I felt everyone else just seemed to be performing better than me.
Yeah, all those, all those. And
a little different. What if you work in a male-dominated group and forms of gaslighting make you feel imposter types of feelings?
Yes, that's very common. And one of the things that that we're looking at right now is the impact of the workplace in terms of climate on that. And that's one of the reasons, at least in the academic experience, both as a student, as a faculty member, it really provides quite fertile ground for imposter experiences to really resonate, because it's so very intellectually focused. I mean, those are our blue chips, if you will, our capital. And without understanding really that it's not completely about that in terms of performance, having candid conversations about just the development experience, and that, no, you're not supposed to know everything, and we need to stop, tone down the social comparisons a bit. Yes. And, be, like I mentioned before, being the only woman or the only Black woman or the only Black man in a workplace, in microaggressions, we're seeing that as related also to impacting, feelings of fraudulence in terms of that. So there's a lot of work to do. It's just not an inside job. Even though I'm speaking today about things that you can do, I do have a couple of comments at the end about implications to the organizational climate in terms of that. But yes, all of those things are, I want everyone to know, as you continue typing those things, that all of those things are normal to feel. It doesn't feel good. And when I say normal, I mean that a lot of people experience that. And so that's the reason I was drawn so much to this approach. One, because it is about sharing your story. It's getting that out. That can be very cathartic in so many ways. Of course, I will say, as Brene Brown will often say, sharing it with someone who has earned the right to hear your story, that it's safe psychologically for you. We do a lot of work in the workshop to keep it small, to create a safe container with that. And so sharing your story where you do feel it's safe and you feel like you're going to be heard will be very important. The stuck points at several, so thank you all that shared that, your stuck points. Really identifying your stuck points. The way that we have individuals do it in the workshop is that we have them write it out. And there's been research to show that physically handwriting versus on the computer, where you can self-correct a lot, actually is a preferred way of doing that. So if you write out an imposter experience, keep it to about a page, identifying one or more stuck points, and then working from that. And so what I mean by working from that is the third piece is challenging the stuck point. And this is where a trusted peer, and you can actually do it with yourself also, but having a peer there is actually quite powerful. And this should be something that looks really familiar to law students, right? The Socratic dialogue. This is what we talk about within the CPT. I think it's Socratic teaching or Socratic questioning is what you do in the law school. I can remember that my dad would use that quite a bit. And not about our education, about like when we were not doing something we were supposed to be doing growing up as kids. He was really good about that, as my sister is as well. So what does that look like from this perspective? So it's clarifying questions to challenge our stuck point. And the whole idea is to build cognitive flexibility. That's really the point of CPT, is because stuck points, because they're stuck, they're really rigid ways of thinking. And again, it creates a slippery slope, almost like an habitual way of thinking. So we use Socratic dialogue to help us examine and challenge assumptions, identify problematic thinking patterns, and of course to increase critical thinking. It's a lot like, you know, when you see a picture, and I'm going to show you one right now, and if you just adjust the way you look at it, you may see something else. So Meredith, I'm going to ask you to look at the chat again. So as you see this picture, tell me what you see.
Okay, so I don't see any, oh, someone says, oh, a woman looking away, a woman's profile. Someone says a young woman and an old hag.
Oh, okay.
Someone says a woman in a fur coat facing away, woman with a hat on, side profile. Older and a younger woman, a woman with a feather boa.
Right. All those are true, right? So when we talk about challenging questions, the idea is to reframe your thinking. Be open to other possibilities. So the example of, you know, feeling scared and not, and thus assuming that I'm never really going to get it, or not really going to fit in, or everyone else seems to be more prepared for this internship, so I'm probably not going to get it. You know, using challenging questions like the ones I'm going to show you now are a way to help adjust the frame. So for those of you that first saw the woman with a side profile, and then you looked for the older woman, your eyes adjusted a bit. Well, again, we're trying to build that flexibility in the way that we think about things. So here are some of the challenging questions that we introduced to individuals in the workshop that have proven very, very effective. The favorite seems to be is, and maybe for law students and those in the law profession, you would like this one too. What is the evidence for the stuck point? What is the evidence against the stuck point? So we have individuals pair up, and they after they read their imposter statement, as we call it, then the other individual asks them these questions. Is the stuck point based on feelings or fact? Often it's the way that we feel is our first experience of it, and then we have to think, well, what is the belief under the feeling there? Well, I think I'm not adequate. Okay, well, we can work with that. Like, so, you know, is it based on feeling or fact? You know, did something actually happen, or it just feels like it happened? How much of the stuck point is exaggerated? If you're like me, one of my thinking challenges can be exaggerating the situation, catastrophizing the situation. So this question is really helpful for me. Is the stuck point focused on part of the story or the entire story? And so asking yourself these questions helps, again, begin removing the layers of that stuck point, lets it breathe a little bit. And again, if you can do it with a friend, a trusted friend, and being able to respond to these, what we found in the workshop is that stuck point became less stuck. It became less charged, and it allowed individuals to consider other possibilities, in some ways to be more gentle with themselves, but consider other possibilities that it has nothing to do with me, you know, how I think of myself as if I'm a good or not researcher, that I didn't have this outcome. It's an outcome that maybe has other explanations or other reasons why it happened. So it really begins allowing for more flexibility. Related to that is identifying problematic thinking patterns. So I'm also curious if you see yourself in any of these thinking patterns, whether it's mind reading, jumping to conclusions, predicting the future, that's a favorite of mine, all or nothing thinking, exaggerating, because these also give fire or fuel to those stuck points. And so if you can identify some of these relative to your stuck point, again, you begin giving it a little space, begin examining it, because for the first time, individuals that begin working in a CPT framework or informed approach, they don't even think about their stuck point as being a stuck point. It is just something that has become so habitual and so tied to their identity that they've really not questioned it in this way. And so I'm hoping now as we've gone through a couple of these things, you're beginning to see that if left unexamined, that's why imposter phenomena can become so destructive in terms of, again, your well-being, or how it shows up in your work, how it shows up in your life, because it's unquestioned. And that's why I titled this, really challenging your flawed logic here. Now, the last thing we do is we have individuals now revisit that story they began with. Do they still associate or describe how they feel, associate why it happened with the same reasons as they did in that original story? Now that they've identified a stuck point or more stuck points, went through that part of challenging those distorted thinking patterns, how are they telling that story now? And what we found in the workshop and in the research is that individuals now could offer other possibilities for why that experience happened. Could again be more flexible in their thinking, could be more compassionate in their assessment of who they are in that story, who they should be in that story, and really kind of who is telling you who you should be in that story, right? So it did allow for a greater understanding of how the imposter phenomenon works, gave them a real concrete tool for challenging that, and also helped individuals understand that they have agency. They have control over the thoughts that they have, because they're just thoughts. They're not always valid. They're certainly not always true. And it's the same thing with feelings. So again, the thinking-feeling connection is really powerful here. When they begin changing their thinking, it had an effect on the emotional resonance around that as well. So these were the 4 steps that we used. Again, CPT in a clinical application is more like 12 steps. So we were able to identify the 4 steps that we thought, and now our research has shown that those were quite powerful in not only decreasing after 3 months, we did a pre and post test, decreasing imposter tendencies after 3 months significantly, and increasing another variable, which is called core self-evaluation, which is, to Meredith's point, our question about self-esteem. It was a variable that had several sub-factors, one of which was self-esteem. And we saw that as significantly increasing at the 3-month mark as a result of this intervention. And you don't have to do the workshop to have those kind of results. Again, this is something that you can do at home, you could do with a trusted friend, but again, just a different way of approaching, again, challenging that inner critic. So I mentioned before, I've talked about it from sort of an inside job perspective. Now I'm going to talk about it a little bit from an outside job perspective, what organizations can also do. I've been an advocate for a very long time that we need to be having these conversations and onboarding discussions with new students, with new employees, as leaders transition into different roles or assignments within the organizations. The more we talk about it and let other people know that a lot of people do struggle with this, the more we can normalize it. And that, to me, is half the issue and half the battle, knowing that it is completely normal. I suffered in silence for way too long. And then as soon as I began talking about it, guess what? All of my colleagues said, oh yeah, me too. So, there's certainly the power in normalizing those experiences. I would argue, especially for individuals who are underrepresented within their cohorts, within their programs, within their departments, their offices, very powerful to get together and to share experiences concerning that. Also identifying characteristics in colleagues and students so that you can proactively support them. Here are some of the characteristics that we and others have found. Overworking, ruminating around issues, or trying to, again engage in perfectionistic behaviors. If you hear a lot of people in your coaching or your performance appraisals just not own any of their successes, it's a typical characteristic of imposters to internalize mistakes and to externalize successes. So that inaccurate attribution is also a classic sign. And then one of the things we've been looking at, especially with women and men of color, is opting out of career advancement opportunities because they're fearful of going through any assessment because of feeling or thinking like an imposter. That can have diminishing returns as well. So again, the things to look out for, both with your students and of course with your colleagues. And lastly, offering support as a developmental resource. I'm in a profession, human resource development. That's our focus. And so understanding how individuals learn and thrive in organizations and building interventions for that. So whether it's through affinity groups, training, or coaching, these are some of the ways to, again, outside of, say, a clinical approach, which is, I think, what a lot of people can relate to, not dissing on clinical approaches, because I've certainly sat in the in a clinician's office many, many times, and I valued that. But my work has really tried to bring it into the workplace as to make it as accessible to as many people in terms of that. So a nod toward what organizations and leaders can be thinking about as a result of some of this work. And lastly, I'll leave you with this. What if your imposter has nothing to do with you being not wonderful or not great? What if it is just a result of thinking errors that you're having that you can challenge and then you can reframe? That's really my offering to you, is to really reflect on, is this just, am I objectively competent? What have I done that I'm suddenly for some reason questioning? And even if I'm young or early in my career, am I giving myself grace enough to know that I'm learning and developing, and really to be okay with that? So my final nod is to Brene Brown, who I adore. She's a research professor here at the University of Houston in the School of Social Work, and I think probably most people know Brene Brown. So, and I love this quote: "When we have the courage to walk into our story and own it, we get to write the ending." And again, that's my hope for you, is that you take back control of that story and that narrative, and you write that ending. So I'll leave it here. If you are interested in contacting me, I'd love to hear from you. And last October, I had the pleasure of doing a TED Talk. So a lot of what I shared today was in that TED Talk, but a little bit more too, so if you're interested in that. So I know we've got about 8 minutes left. I'm happy to answer questions. So I will ask Meredith again as a wonderful co-host, she and Jeff.
We
Do you
have
have any questions?
There are a couple of good questions, and I wanted to pose to you. I know a few students might have to jump off a little bit early because they have class at 1. But the one question is, this person says, has your research shown if imposter phenomenon seems to be more prevalent in this age of social media? Whereas a few years ago, most professionals feeling some level of inadequacy had only those around them to compare themselves against. Nowadays, on sites like LinkedIn, you see hundreds, if not thousands, of apparently uber successful, driven, motivated individuals that one can only hope to emulate. Wondering if your research supports this anecdotal view. Thank you.
Yeah, that observation is quite accurate in terms of the impression management individuals do on social media, all of which could be true for a person. But it does, I've heard so many people actually just get off social media because they were starting to have a lot of self-doubts because of what the wonderful, experience of all these individuals. And that really is what we found as the importance of social support and having individuals help you sort of, process that as well. And yes, that is a big, I think it's more prevalent now. That's the short answer. And one factor is just social media and how much we are on it and using that for a platform for impression management. Yeah. Great question.
Here's another question from a member of the faculty here. I have let's see, this person says, sometimes as a professor, I see students who never volunteer, but who when called on are quite impressive. That could be imposter syndrome, or it could be something else. Is there anything I should do as a faculty member to address that possibility? Or as a non-professional, should I just leave it alone? Or is it better addressed as a general statement for the entire class, noting the possibility and identifying sources of assistance?
I think especially if you're working with new students, or even if you have, again, a lot of, first or only individuals within a classroom, I think it's always good to make a statement, especially if you're getting into difficult content around maybe that people will struggle, and it's okay to ask questions, etc. But in terms from an instructional or pedagogical perspective, I think offering different ways to share ideas within the classroom, some students are just not comfortable in sharing, but as on discussion boards or other ways through writing, that's really where they prefer to share. So I don't think it's a one approach fix. I think you can certainly make a statement. If you see also that it's fairly persistent with a student, maybe having a one-on-one conversation with a student. I don't suggest coming out and say, do you feel like an imposter, like right out of the gate? I do, acknowledging what you see in this student and acknowledging the strengths and just asking questions perhaps. I've noticed that you're not speaking up a lot. Is there something that I could do, or are you feeling comfortable in the class? And you may learn about some other concerns that student has, or that they just prefer a different way of communicating and sharing their ideas.
Great.
I had a question, if I may. So
yeah,
just to follow up on the last question that was just asked, what resources are there? I know about CAPS. We're told about CAPS, and we know that exists, but is there anything that we should be telling students, or any further resources, especially surrounding cognitive therapy? Because I think it sounds really important as a modality.
Yeah, it is. And of course, there's cognitive processing therapy, there's cognitive behavioral therapy. They sort of, sit within the same general domain. I'm not a clinician by any means, but I would say that CAPS is a great resource. Their student service fees pays for so many sessions with CAPS, and then also reaching out to the Graduate College of Social Work too, to see what resources they can recommend. It is a fabulous college, and so I would look into that. I do know that I can't remember this College of Pharmacy or College of Optometry, who actually had a CAPS representative come in back when we were on campus a lot, actually be there just for their students, I think once a week. I want to say it was College of Pharmacy that did that, because they were seeing a lot in their first years, a lot of struggling around identity issues, imposter phenomena. And so they intentionally had someone from CAPS within their college just for their students, I think 1 or 2 days a week. So that might be something to explore as well.
Great, thank you. I guess we have time for just one more question, and then we'll call it an afternoon. This is one that we received multiple times actually from different people. They wanted to know if imposter phenomenon is something that is more prevalent in particular cultures as contrasted with other cultures, or are there other cultures or countries or what have you where this doesn't exist as a phenomenon?
Yeah, that's a great question. I haven't seen any research that has looked at, sort of a cross-cultural, taken a cross-cultural lens to this. So I'm not sure, but what I would suspect is that we would see differences across cultures in terms of this. I think also depending on how we're taught to internalize success. I think, in the West, there is a lot of focus on this outward appearance, outward success, and that becomes really fertile ground for this social comparison. So yes, that's a really interesting question in terms of that. I think it would differ though, based on cultural tendencies.
Well, great. Well, thank you very much. We're just delighted to have you. We've learned so much information, and this is something that all of us may encounter, whether we're faculty or parents, kids, or students. So thank you very much for enlightening us. We appreciate your time, and we can't thank you enough.
Thank you, everyone, and go Cougs.